So we're going to go ahead and continue on because I do have some things I'd like to talk about. This half of the lecture is not a half. It's a little bit less than a half. We'll see how that goes. So we've read some text this evening. The next text that we're going to read, and we've already read it in its entirety. So I just want to pull up the snippet and talk a little bit about the timing of Jesus' birth. So Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 says, "In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered." All right, so I'm using that verse. By the way, Mark chapter 14, verses 14 and 15 is virtually identical to that. That gives us a parallel. So I want to use that verse as an opportunity to talk a little bit about the year of Jesus' birth. Probably, if you were to ask 100 people on the street, in what year was Jesus born? I would suspect that a whole lot of people would say he was born in the year 0, right? Because that just makes sense, because BC, 1 BC, 1 before Christ, 1 AD, 1 after Christ, or in the year of our Lord, 1. Interestingly enough, there is no year 0, okay? A year 0 does not exist. You go from 1 BC, on midnight of 1 BC, it became 1 AD, okay? So Jesus was not born in the year 0. So when was Jesus born? We get some information here in the text, and I think we can at least pin it down in a general way. The first bit of information we get is from the text that we just read about Augustus. We know when Augustus is emperor, he rules from 27 BC to 14 AD. So Augustus has to be emperor when Jesus is born. That gets us, well, somewhat of a narrow window, not a very narrow, but a little bit, sometime between 27 BC and 14 AD. We also know that he was born while Herod was king. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 1. I'm going to read that really quick for us. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 1. "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem." We're going to talk about those guys in just a little while. So not only is Augustus the Caesar, Herod is king of the Jews. We know when that happened as well. He rules from 37 BC to 4. You ready for this? 4 BC, okay? Not 4 AD. That is not a typo. He lives and reigns to 4 BC. So if you take those two windows and put them together, now we've narrowed it down to between 27 BC and 4 BC. That gets us in a closer window there. Herod has to be alive. Herod dies in 4 BC. We know from the Gospels approximately how old Jesus is when he begins to minister, when he begins to preach, and we can place some other information after that. What we get from all of that is that given the information we have about the wise men, they're coming to see Herod. We know when Herod dies, Herod sends them to Bethlehem. We can narrow down Jesus' birth year to sometime between 6 BC and 4 BC. So, right now, you may be sitting there and saying, well, wait a minute, sorry, just a second. I set an alarm so I know when intermission was over, and now it's telling me intermission was over. I started this early. So, if we lay that information out there together, we're sitting there looking at that, and we're saying, well, how could Jesus have been born in 4 before Christ, right? Are you scratching your heads about that a little bit? It's because our calendars are wrong, okay? They established a calendar and they established dates, and they realized later that the dates were wrong. But it's a whole system. So what do you do when you find out your dates are wrong? You leave them. And you end up with an anomaly like this, that Jesus was born in about 4 before Christ. Now remember, in the first century, they're dating years by the emperor. They're not dating years by when Jesus was born. People come up with that later, okay? And because their data is a little bit off, we end up with the whole thing being shifted a little bit, all right? So Jesus is born at the latest 4 BC. Why? Because Herod is alive when he's born, and Herod dies in 4 BC, and that is a well-established historical fact, okay, about when Herod dies. So that's the year of Jesus' birth. What about the date of Jesus' birth? I was asked by a couple of individuals on Facebook, off Facebook, whether I was going to talk about December 25th. I am going to talk about December 25th, okay? So what is the date of Jesus' birth? Well, depending upon who you ask, you get some different answers. So for example, December the 25th is the date that is put forward as the birth of Jesus in Western Christianity. So Roman Catholic Church and Western Europe, if you will, and North America for the most part from that. It is also used by some Eastern churches also, December the 25th. However, it is worth noting, a couple of things that are worth noting. One is that even in the Catholic Church, it is not taught that Jesus was born on December the 25th. That is the date in which it is celebrated. And there is a difference about that, okay? We'll talk about a church calendar here in a little while. But even with that, we also need to remember that the earliest reference to December the 25th dates to about 336 AD. That's the earliest reference we have where people are saying Jesus' birth is celebrated on December the 25th. Well, if you've just followed me on the math, Jesus is born in 4 BC. Our earliest reference is 336. We have a difference of 340 years. Okay? 340 years from the actual birth of Jesus before December the 25th is put out. And oh, by the way, when December the 25th is put out, it is by no means unanimous. There were other dates that were put out as well. Some early writers put out a date that was in the spring. Others put out a date that was in the fall. In other words, there was not a unanimous consensus among everyone as far as December the 25th. Even today, there are other dates for Christmas. So you have, for example, January the 6th, January the 7th. Those two dates, specifically January the 7th, are used in most Eastern Orthodox churches. So if you were to go to Russia, I don't recommend that right now. If you were to go to the Ukraine, don't recommend that either. But if you were to go to Russia or the Ukraine, they will not be celebrating Christmas on December the 25th. They will, however, be celebrating Christmas on January the 7th. Because that is Christmas on the Orthodox calendar. January the 19th as well is another date for celebrating Christmas that is out there. I bring all that up to point out, one, the date is late, okay? Late in coming. Christians have been around for a very long time. First century, nobody's worried about the date of Jesus' birth. Second century, nobody's worried about the date of Jesus' birth. Christians aren't even celebrating birthdays, so they don't really care about this birthday either. It's only later that people begin to be concerned about that. When are we going to celebrate that? And various dates are put forth. And even today, among churches that are claiming to follow Jesus, they have different dates for Jesus' birth. Let's look on a little bit more at this. What's interesting to me, again, as we look at the Scriptures, this is perception and reality. As we look at the reality of the Scriptures, the Bible doesn't connect Jesus' birth with any identifiable festival or event. So, for example, if you come back here in April, we're going to have another lecture like this one on the death of Jesus. The death of Jesus is very clearly connected to an identifiable festival among the Jews. That festival being Passover. When we get to the narratives of Jesus' birth, there isn't anything that connects Jesus' birth with any festival. Luke doesn't write on the third day of the Festival of Lights. Luke doesn't write at the week before the Festival of Tabernacles. Nothing like that is given in the Scriptures. Not in Luke, not in Matthew, not in John, not in Mark. It's just not there. So then we get the question, well, is it winter? Is it spring? Is it summer? Is it fall? The perception, again, is what? That it is winter. Right? That is so ingrained in us as Westerners because we all live in the northern hemisphere, right? And so winter is cold, isn't it? And so people do, and the nights are long. So what do we all do at Christmas time? We put lights on our houses and things like that. Maybe most of us or some of us do at any rate. Because it makes everything cheerful because the nights are so long. Even in Texas, they're pretty long, all right? We're in the northern hemisphere. So Christmas is very much associated with winter. So we have all our Christmas carols, and we have all the other things that go along with Christmas, and it's all winter. What if you live in Australia? It didn't winter down there at all. What if you're in South Africa? It didn't winter there either. It's summer in those parts of the world. But in the northern hemisphere, it's winter. So we associate it generally with winter, and a winter date was chosen. December the 25th. As far as evidence for the date of Jesus' birth from the Scriptures, the evidence is mixed at best. And I will tell you that most arguments for and against are pretty unsatisfying. We're going to talk about one of those right now. So in Luke chapter 2 and verse 8, we get our reference there to the shepherds that we're going to talk more about. Luke chapter 2 and verse 8 says, and in the same region there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. All right. So I will tell you, I'm 54 years old. I grew up in the church, okay? That's my background. And I remember, I don't know how many times I heard preachers in the pulpit say, December the 25th can't be the birth of Jesus because the shepherds were in the fields with their flocks. And they're never in the fields in winter with their flocks. And so I heard that so many times that it almost became a dogma for me when I would talk to somebody and they would say, well, Jesus was born on December the 25th. Well, what were the shepherds doing out in the fields and with the flocks? As if that was the deciding answer to that argument. Again, I'll go back to what I said a minute ago. The evidence is mixed at best, and it is less than satisfying. So let's talk a little bit more about this. We have to ask ourselves the question, do shepherds in the area have their flocks out at night in winter? I am very thankful for today being 70, because I get to illustrate what I'm talking about. Today was a wonderful day, wasn't it? If you like warm weather. I stepped out this morning, and it was probably already like almost 70, and I smelled the air, and it smelled like spring. And as Yvonne and I were enjoying our cup of coffee in the afternoon, we looked out in the backyard, and two blue jays, a mama blue jay and a daddy blue jay, I would presume, were flitting about in our tree looking for something to eat, probably because they're getting to build a nest. And as you drove this evening, you probably noticed how all the leaves are red and yellow. It's December. It's December, what are we on the 15th? Those trees should be bare. There shouldn't be any leaves out there, and yet there they are. Weather is variable. So today, I wore short sleeves. I didn't wear a jacket because the weather was nice. So when we ask this question, what about these shepherds out at night? It's variable. It depends upon the weather. Now, I will say that warmer periods are clearly much more likely to see the flocks out at night. But even in December, you might see the flocks out at night. So the flocks being out at night does not preclude December the 25th, or any other date in December, or in January, or in February, or in November. That isn't evidence from the Scriptures that will help us solve this problem. So I'll share a couple of photos with y'all. They're not my photos, but this is of the Judean, or it's in the Judean wilderness, which is 6 miles east of Bethlehem. And here we have a shepherd, well, he's not in the photo, but his sheep are, out in the fields with his sheep. It was on Christmas 1993. The person who took that photograph made note of that. Christmas 1993. And they talked to the shepherd that was out there, and they asked the shepherd, and the shepherd said, I've been out here all night with my flock. So in 1993, it was warm enough for the shepherd to be out in the field with his flock. I'll share another photograph with you. This is Jerusalem, 6 miles north of Bethlehem. So 6 miles north as opposed to 6 miles east of Bethlehem. This particular photo is undated, but it is recent. Okay, recent being within the last 20 years or so. And it is Jerusalem under snow. We don't think of Jerusalem getting snow, do we? Not usually. Jerusalem actually gets less on average, and I had to look this up on weather websites, averages less than 1 day with snow in the winter. And accumulations of snow like that one only every 3 to 4 years. Interestingly, Bethlehem averages 3 days with snowfall in the winter. It's variable. When Ivana and I moved here, we moved here in 2008, I told Ivana she did not need to bring her heavy winter coats with her from the Czech Republic because we would never need them in Texas. That winter, we had a 100-year snowfall. We had 12 inches of snow on the ground. in Dallas-Fort Worth. And of course, Ivana immediately pointed out to me, being the loving wife that she is, and always quick to catch me when I am clearly wrong. Thought you said we never need our winter coats. All right, well, this is the exception that proves the rule. And then lo and behold, 2 years ago at the end of February, we had -4 in Dallas-Fort Worth. Yeah. Laugh about it now. You weren't around back then, kid. Electricity was going in and out. The water plant in Fort Worth froze. We didn't have water. We were using snow to flush toilets. It was like the Wild West again. But it never snows in Texas, right? Well, it depends on the year, because sometimes it snows a lot. So we get this record from Luke that the shepherds are out in the fields, and that tells us nothing about the date of Jesus' birth. What it does tell us is that the shepherds are out in the fields, so the angels can appear to them and say, you go into the town of Bethlehem and see the newborn Messiah. And that's about all it tells us. So again, the evidence is mixed, the date of Jesus' birth. So how did December the 25th, at least in Western Christianity, become the chosen date for Jesus' birth? Again, several dates were put forward during the period 200 to 400 AD. And finally, in the Roman Catholic Church, and because it was in the Roman Catholic Church, all the Protestant churches adopted that as well. December the 25th was set aside and adopted as part of the liturgical year. Oh boy, what in the world is that? We at North Beach do not have a liturgical year, do we? If we do, you don't know what it even is. Raise your hand if you know what a liturgical year is. Wow. Drew does, because Drew grew up in the Catholic Church. He knows what it is. Liturgical year is the calendar that the church follows. So you have saints that have particular days. You have Easter. You have Christmas. You have Epiphany. Okay? These are dates that, as members of the church, we're not generally very familiar with. But they are very important in churches that follow a liturgical calendar. So, for example, in a liturgical calendar, the church hierarchy will decide what the readings are on any given Sunday. Aaron is used to the fact that I put readings in the bulletin. And if I do my job right, I actually remember to put new ones in there each week. And those are the readings that are used in our services. But if I'm in certain churches, there's a reading that is given for that Sunday. And so everywhere in the world, that reading is read on that Sunday. That's a liturgical year. Well, if you've got the death of Jesus and you've got Pentecost, okay, there's another one. You've got the Annunciation, where the angel comes and visits Mary. You got to have the birth. Well, where are you going to put it? We got to put it somewhere. December the 25th was the chosen date. And so that's how it became part of the calendar. However, if you will look very closely at Roman Catholic sources, they don't actually say that Jesus was born on that day. What they say is that's the day where we celebrate his birth. That's a fine line of distinction, but it's a distinction nonetheless. So what else can we say about this? We've got December the 25th. That's what most of the world, in our part of the world, follows. Well, again, what I said earlier, Jews and Christians did not emphasize the celebration of birthdays. It just wasn't important. The Bible itself gives no firm information about Jesus' day of birth. In fact, celebrating Jesus' birth only came later. When was he born? People will sometimes say, well, Mary surely would have known that. Every day, people immigrate to this country from Africa. People immigrate to this country from South America. People immigrate to this country sometimes from Asia. And sometimes when they are required to put a birth date on their identification papers, they have to make one up. Because they come from countries where birthdays are not recorded and not important and they're not celebrated, and no one knows exactly when they were born. And so in the ancient world, we see the same thing. So what can we say? December the 25th or some other time? Okay? But we can't say anything more than that because the scriptures don't tell us anything more than that. All right, let's continue on our next little topic and looking at this. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. That's Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. I want to read Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. So let me turn there. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, and read the story, and then we're going to talk about it. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who's been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So they come looking for Jesus to Jerusalem. That's where you'd expect. That's where the king is, right? And a new king has been born. So he must have been born in the royal palace. Herod said, no king born around here. So let's find out where the king was born. Bethlehem, according to prophecy. Verse 7. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. And after listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, by the way, where do they go? Just throw this out there. They go into the house. Okay. They saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So let's talk about the wise men, or the term I want to use tonight are the Magi. Okay, that's a little bit different term. We might be familiar with that. What can we say about the visit of the Magi? Well, every good nativity scene is going to have 3. And in fact, if you ask people what were their names, people will tell you, well, it was Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar. Those are the names of the 3 wise men that came to see Jesus. They are often depicted as kings. We saw that in the opening illustration. And they are almost always 3 in number. As a matter of fact, I find it highly unlikely you will ever find a depiction that depicts 4. And you will highly unlikely ever find a depiction that depicts 2. They almost always depict 3, unless someone just decided to buck the trend and write 2 or write 4 in his drawing. There has been a lot of embellishment beyond the Bible about these 3. Sometimes about the shepherds, but really about these 3. See, I just said that. Did you follow me? Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. Those are our 3. Sometimes they get variant names, but those are the 3 that are usually put forward. So let's talk about that. We read the text here. What do we know about these folks? Well, they are uncertain in number, but they did bring 3 very expensive and precious gifts. We would look at those gifts and we would say, well, gold, duh, that's valuable. It was valuable then, valuable today. Want to make an impression on your wife, especially with the cost of gold these days? Buy her a nice solid gold necklace for Christmas. She'll either be impressed or she'll slap you because you used your credit card to buy something that expensive. Gold's expensive today. It was expensive in the ancient world as well. Frankincense and myrrh, we don't talk about frankincense and myrrh, right? Well, frankincense and myrrh were valuable as well. Frankincense is tree resin. It comes from 2 places in the world. One is Yemen and the other is Somalia. That's it. That's where frankincense comes from. And so people go out and they collect tree sap from these trees, and when it's dried, it can be burned as incense. It's usually burned on a charcoal disc of some kind, and it makes a really pleasant aroma. That's incense. It was expensive. Joseph and Mary are not the kind of people that are going to have frankincense and myrrh in their house, and probably not a whole lot of gold either. But that's what's brought to Jesus. Now, I'm just going to throw this out there. I don't want to dwell a lot on it, but we know what's going to happen to Jesus here pretty quick, isn't he? He's going to have to flee to Egypt because Herod's out to kill him. When he flees to Egypt, Don't you think those 3 gifts would have providentially been great for that young and impoverished family? Because when they get to Egypt, they can go down to the market and trade some of that frankincense and trade some of that myrrh for food. And they can do the same with the gold. So it is, again, God's providence for Jesus and for Jesus' family. They do come, the text tells us, from the east. So we know where they're from. We know how many gifts they have. We don't know how many of them they are, and we don't know their names. So what in the world were these magi? Well, a magus, that's a single of that. I had to look that up. I had no idea. A magus, according to Barry Beitzel, these folks were members of a Persian priestly caste that specialized in astrology, magic, divination, and the interpretation of dreams. And we read about people like this in the book of Daniel. So in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 20, and I will look at that one, Daniel chapter 1 and verse 20, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these Jewish young men, in every matter about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were all in all his kingdom. So here you've got ancient Babylon. You've got these people that are wise men, if you will, because they're studying natural phenomenon. We would look at that, and we'd say astrology, that's not science. And indeed, astrology is not science. But in the ancient world, astrology and astronomy were one and the same. These were people who were the educated classes of ancient Mesopotamian society. So they're the ones that are coming later, okay, obviously not the ones of Daniel, coming to seek out this newborn king of the Jews. So to give you an idea, this is a map. Where would they have traveled from? Well, Persia is out here. Babylon is down here, okay? Persia's a little bit farther. It doesn't say where they came from, except they came from the east. They would have traveled north, because you don't travel across here. You travel north, and then you travel south. The route was 900 miles. It would take them approximately 120 days to make that journey, assuming that one day's travel was 17 to 23 miles per day. However, if you're traveling in a caravan, and lots of people did because it was safety in numbers, or if you were going through difficult terrain, you might only get 6 miles a day. What that tells us about these men as they're headed to see Jesus is they've spent a lot of time on the road, okay? This wasn't just going from Jerusalem down to Bethlehem. This wasn't going from Nazareth to Bethlehem. This was going from a completely different country, some of which would have been outside the borders of the Roman Empire at this time, traveling to see this newborn king. They would have spent a lot of time on that journey. So, let's talk a little bit, very briefly, because time is running away from us, about the Jews of the East and the Messiah. The reality is, we remember from our Bible history that God sends the Jews into captivity. The northern kingdom, 722, the southern kingdom starting in 605, final group 586. They're carried off into captivity. 70 years after that first group of the southern kingdom is carried away, 605, they're allowed to go home. Hooray, right? It's time to go home. We get to go back to Jerusalem. We get to go back to where we came from. And lots of Jews will do that. Lots of Jews won't. They kind of like living in Babylon. And they kind of like living in Persia. And so they say, you know what? We're going to stay right here. We read about a couple of them. We read about Nehemiah, for example. We read about Esther, for example, in the Bible. Those were Jews. I mean, Nehemiah goes back to Judea. I understand that. But he didn't at first. And Esther didn't at all. So there were Jews who stayed behind. There was a large population of Jews living in that part of the world since the Old Testament, living both in Babylon and in Persia. They would have kept a knowledge of their scriptures. And because of people like Daniel and because of people like Esther, there would have been other people who would have taken an interest in those scriptures as well. So we can read a couple of passages from the Old Testament that might have piqued the interest of these wise men. The first of those is Numbers chapter 24 and verse 17. Numbers chapter 24 and verse 17. This is the prophecy given by a man named Balaam. Balaam was not a Jew. He was a prophet, but not a Jew. And notice what he says here in this oracle. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. What's interesting about Balaam is his oracle is recorded in the Jewish Old Testament, but Balaam was talked about by people who were not even Jews. There is a Balaam inscription from the Old Testament period. It's an inscription about Balaam. So people knew who this guy was. And in this oracle, he talks about a star that's going to come out of Jacob and a scepter that's going to rise out of Israel. And Jewish people of the Old Testament period interpreted that as a messianic prophecy. So you've got the wise men in the east. They see a star. Their natural conclusion is what? This prophecy is being fulfilled. Look with me, if you would, in Isaiah 60, if you're following along in your Bible. Isaiah chapter 60 and verse 3. Another prophecy, that's a messianic prophecy. And nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. So there's enough information in the Jewish scriptures that would indicate that these wise men knew exactly what that star rising was all about. That finally the Jewish Messiah has come. And so they do whatever it is they need to do over there in Persian Babylon to get ready to make this 4-month journey to see this new king. What were their names? Don't know. Scriptures don't tell us. We'll say this about the star, and I'm only mentioning this because a lot gets written about the star. We need to understand, some people will say, well, it was a comet. Some people will say it was a supernova. Some people will say it was a conjunction of planets. Okay? All of these are normal celestial events. But the star here is not a usual star. It rises. It tells the wise men they need to go. They go to Jerusalem. When they get to Jerusalem, Herod says, eventually finds out, you need to go down to Bethlehem. Okay, great. We're going to go down to Bethlehem. And what the text tells us is that the star settles over the house where Jesus is. And that's how they know which house to go to find this newborn king. So it's not a star like a supernova, not a star like a comet. If it is, it's traveling in a very unusual way to indicate one house in one little town. But what is significant is that the rising of this star had indicated to the Magi, or the wise men, that the new king had been born, and it will lead them to the house where Jesus is so that they can go in and worship him. So we've got these shepherds that have come in. Talked about them a little bit earlier. The shepherds have come in. They worship Jesus, the common people. People like you and I, for the most part, go in and see Jesus. And now we've got these wise men who bring very expensive gifts to this newborn king. Isn't that wonderful? It is wonderful. Because Jesus is for all people. But the story is not finished here. Because remember, Herod says, you go down there and you find this newborn king. You come back and let me know where he is, because I want to go and worship him. Which brings me to the last section this evening. That is Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. We're going to read the whole text, verses 13 through 18. Now when they had departed, these wise men, they've been warned, don't go back to Herod. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region, who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. You go from these depictions of the nativity. The cow, the donkey, the sheep, the shepherds, the wise men, the gifts, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, maybe some other people as well. And then the very next depiction, if you follow Western art, is these horrific depictions of Herod's soldiers going into Bethlehem and with their swords killing all these boys under the age of 2. I'd like to finish my lecture this evening with one last section. It is a tale of two kings. Because we look at that, we look at these murders that are depicted here, and at first glance what we do is we look at that and we say, that is incredible to believe. Surely Herod would not have done something like that. In fact, what a lot of people will do is say, wow, that just cannot be true. Because it's inconceivable for us in our minds to think that a king would just order all these baby boys wiped out. Because one of them's a king. At least that's what he hopes. What he doesn't know is God's already gotten his son out of there. So at first glance it is incredible, almost impossible to believe. But what's interesting to me, and I want to make this point about Luke. Luke is accurate. In the Gospel of Luke, when he writes things, they're accurate. When he gets to the book of Acts, which is the continuation of the Gospel of Luke, he is accurate. He records all sorts of historical details. And here's the deal. In every one of those details that we can verify, he is demonstrated to be trustworthy. And when he describes Herod in this way, he describes him to a T. Because this is completely in line with Herod's character. So, note this. Herod is king of the Jews. King of the Jews from 37 to 4 BC. He has a mixed ancestry. Okay? He's half Idumean. The Idumean are the New Testament equivalent of the Edomites of the Old Testament. They're not Jews. But in the intertestamental period, they are forced to become Jews. And so his ancestors are forced to become Jews. But he's not a Jew of the Old Testament covenant. But he's king of the Jews because he's a converted Jew, or his ancestors were, and that's good enough to make him king of the Jews. Herod was an individual who ruthlessly consolidated power. He eliminated any actual threats or perceived threats. You did not want Herod to think you were after his throne. Because if he did, you were not going to last very long. So some examples of Herod's ruthlessness, and I have limited myself to what I can put on 2 slides. Okay? I kid you not. He was a real monster. Okay? So Herod's ruthlessness. He had a brother-in-law. His brother's name was Aristobulus. Had him killed. Then he had an uncle named Joseph. Had him killed as well. He only reigns 33 years as king of the Jews. I want you to remember that. Then he has a wife named Mariamne. He has her killed. So far he's gotten rid of his brother-in-law, his uncle, and his wife. She was actually his second wife. Okay? Then he has his mother-in-law killed. Her name was Alexandra. Every single one of these are family members who he's having killed. So then he's got a brother-in-law. We don't know too much about this guy, but his name is Costobarus. He has him killed as well. Threat. Were they? Didn't matter whether you were or not. If Herod thought you were, and he got rid of you eventually. Then, you think that's bad? Kill your wife, kill your mother-in-law, kill your uncle, kill your brother-in-law, kill 2 brother-in-laws. Then, he kills some other people. So he kills 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. They are killed in 7 BC. They're executed, supposedly because they were plotting against the Father. They may have been plotting against the Father. But whether it's true or not, it's irrelevant. They're executed. 7 BC. 4 BC is when Herod dies. So we're getting close to the end of his reign, right? It's not like he's going to be king much longer anyways. But he's hanging on to power. So in 7 BC, 2 of his sons are killed. Then, in 4 BC, 5 days before his own death. At this point in time, he's sick. He knows he's sick. He probably knows he's dying. And he has Antipater executed as well. That was another son. So when these wise men come to Jerusalem and they say, hey, we've traveled a long way. We want to see this new king that's been born. What's Herod thinking? I killed all of these people who were after my throne. I killed Alexander and Aristobulus because I couldn't trust them. I killed Antipater because I couldn't trust him. What is one little Jewish boy in Bethlehem? You go find him. I'll worship him. That's the story. But in reality, he wants to kill him. And when he doesn't get what he wants, he says, we're going to take care of this. How long ago did the star appear? 2 years. Okay, if you're a Jewish boy of Bethlehem and around Bethlehem, and you're 2 years old or younger, you're going to die. And he kills him. In fact, this is one of my favorite quotes from the ancient world. Ivana's heard it many times, and she said, I've heard that so many times. This is what the Emperor Augustus said about Herod. It is better to be Herod's pig than his son. Why is that? Because Jews don't eat pigs. And so if you're a pig and you're Herod's pig, you're probably going to live to a ripe old age of pigdom. But if you're his son and he thinks you're after the throne, you're probably not going to live very long at all. He kills 3 of his own sons. So what are a bunch of little baby boys in Bethlehem to this king? Nothing at all. A tale of 2 kings. Jesus is nothing at all like Herod. When you read these narratives of what's going on here in Luke and in Matthew particularly, you see this king who's doing anything and everything he can to get rid of this new king. Jesus isn't like that at all. Jesus is born in humble surroundings among the common people. Remember little town of Bethlehem. Remember the shepherds. Jesus is born to save men, not to ruthlessly murder any and all opponents. You could not ask for a stronger contrast between 2 kings. Herod on one hand, who kills his own family members, including his own sons, and Jesus, who comes to die for the sins of mankind. A tale of 2 kings. Let me sum this up a little bit with just some last points, and then we'll have another opportunity for questions. The birth of Jesus. Hopefully this evening, what I've tried to do, and I hope I've accomplished it, is I hope that we've gained a little bit deeper understanding of what the narratives say about Jesus. It is interesting to me that although I don't see the birth of Jesus being celebrated in Scripture, it is equally true that the Scripture spends a lot of time talking about the birth of Jesus. Jesus' birth is important, okay? Sometimes what we do is we throw the baby out with the bathwater. We shouldn't celebrate the birth of Jesus, some will say. So we're not going to think about the birth of Jesus at all. And yet, God's Word spends time talking about this because this is the coming of the Messiah into the world. This is what the wise men understood, God fulfilling His plan. So let's go seek out this new king. I hope as well this evening that we've gained a greater appreciation of how God brought His Son into the world. We talked about providence. That was a question that was raised. There's a lot of providence going on in these stories as God arranges things so that His Son can come into the world. And I hope as well that we gain a better insight into Jesus' life and mission. That is it. That is the birth of Jesus, a historical exploration. I'm going to look at my watch. It tells me it is 8:08. Wow. See, I thought we were going to get out early tonight. Boy, was I wrong. People here at Beach will tell you I am always wrong when I say we're going to get out early. So I guess I should have said we're going to get out late. So here's the deal. If you need to leave, I understand that. It's 8:08 and it's Saturday night. You will not offend me. You will not hurt my feelings at all. I would only ask that if you do that, that you go ahead and exit, because those that want to stay, that have some questions, I'm going to stay here for a little while and we'll answer those questions that you have. Austin, are you still good with that mic? Austin is still good with that mic. So can we do it that way? So if you got some questions, go ahead and raise your hand. If you need to leave, that's okay. Again, you're not going to offend me. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I understand it's late. And some of y'all have a ways to travel. Thank you for coming this evening. I do appreciate that. We've got folks from Wichita Falls and Graham and Richardson and other places, and so it's really good that you've come out this evening. So any questions that you'd like to ask? All right, if you would, Austin, up here. By the way, if you're leaving, please take one of the cards for the lecture in April.
Is there much discussion in the scientific world about the very interesting genetics that Jesus would have had, probably only having genetics from Mary and not Joseph?
I don't know whether there's a lot of discussion about that. When you talk about miracles and how God performs miracles, the fact that it's a miracle means that it's not happening with normal ways. So I'm assuming, because Jesus was human, he had to have a full set of chromosomes. Usually you get it half from mom, half from dad. Whatever the miracle was, God made sure Jesus was fully human, so he had all the chromosomes necessary. But how exactly, I don't know. You're welcome.
Was the timing of the shepherds and the kings being there at the same time, is that biblical?
The answer to that would be no, they're not there at the same time. Okay? Remember the perception versus reality. The picture that's seen is they're all right there. The shepherds go the night of Jesus' birth. The text tells us that. The wise men get to Jerusalem and they want to know where the Messiah was born. They're sent to Bethlehem. Now, it doesn't take very long to get to Bethlehem, but they get to Bethlehem. The star indicates to them where that house is. They go in. And I will grant that it's an assumption, okay? But my assumption based on all this information is that it was some amount of time after Jesus was born. How much time? I can't say. But the idea that the wise men and the shepherds would be there at the same time, again, I think that's what people have drawn and we're used to. I don't think that's really what the scriptures describe. But how much time elapsed, I don't know, between the two. Might there have been other shepherds? There's a lot of things the scriptures don't tell us. So you've got these shepherds that are in the field. They've gone to see this newborn Messiah. I kind of have a feeling they told other people about this kid. And maybe there were other people that came in and visited. The scriptures are silent about that, okay? We know about the wise men, we know about the shepherds, but they don't seem to be there at the same time. Okay? Any other questions? All right, over here.
The Magi are supposed to, at least with the Greek term, supposed to refer to high-ranking priests from Persia, not three kings. And they were very politically powerful. That's why Herod was concerned about them. Is that your understanding?
I don't think Herod would have been concerned about their political power because their political power would have been outside the Roman Empire. Herod's political power was based on his alliance with Rome, specifically Augustus. Okay? So I don't think he was concerned about their political power. He was concerned about who this new king is. Because Herod had his own will. He killed 3 of his sons. He didn't kill all of his sons. And he divides up his kingdom into various territories after his death. And Augustus will ratify that will once it gets to Rome. He'll say, yep, we'll do that. Okay? So I don't think he's worried about their political power. These people would have had a certain amount of power in their native country, in their native courts, because they were the people that were looked up to. They would be what we would call today the president's cabinet. They're the ones that are closest to the president, closest to the king. They're the ones that give him advice. And so, like the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Treasurer, all those guys that are in the cabinet that the next president is busily trying to put into place, they have the president's ear. I don't have the president's ear. I'm a nobody. Okay? President Trump's not going to call me and say, Stephen, what do you think about this, that, or that? But that cabinet will. These wise men would have the king's ear, but back in their country, not in the Roman Empire.
Just one more. The swaddling cloths, it's supposed to refer to, I guess you call them bandages wrapped around the lamb's legs to protect their legs from, blemishes. Supposedly because they were, Bethlehem was used as a breeding ground for temple lamb sacrifices, and they had to be a higher quality. And then you see the correlation there with Jesus being the lamb. And
You know, yes, there were flocks of sheep in the Bethlehem area that were used for the temple. But whether that was a situation at that exact time is up for question. And the New Testament never identifies these shepherds as being involved with those flocks. So, yes, Bethlehem was important for the sheep, but, you know, the New Testament writings don't connect those two dots. That doesn't mean they're not connected. Okay, maybe we're supposed to connect those two dots, but the New Testament doesn't do it for us. So I would at least urge a little bit of caution in making that point.
I think I missed one thing. You were on Herod and were discussing what a terrible person he was. You went to Luke and talk about Luke's accuracy writing to Theophilus, but we're reading about Herod in a different gospel.
We're reading about Herod and Matthew. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
You're absolutely correct. It's not Luke, it's Matthew. And again, we see a good depiction of Herod's character. So it's not out of character at all for what Herod was like. I mean, and everybody in the first century knew that about Herod. I mean, Herod, by the way, when Herod's really sick, and this is maybe a little bit of an apocryphal story, I think it's got probably some good basis in fact, but it's not the gospel truth. When Herod knows he's going to die, he orders the arrest of all the Jewish leaders. They're to be kept under guard, and when he dies, they're all to be executed. Now, why would he want all these Jewish leaders killed when he's already dead? Because he knows the Jews will not mourn him, but they will mourn all these Jewish leaders. Now, the guys that had these people under guard did not carry out his orders. But that's the kind of man Herod was. Just absolutely ruthless. By the way, he built some really neat things. You go to Israel, you see Caesarea, that's Herod. You go to Israel, you see Herodium, that's Herod. You go to Israel to Jerusalem and you see the Wailing Wall, that's Herod. He built a lot of things. He built some pagan temples as well. He was not a nice guy. Thank you for clarifying that for me. Over here, John, is that John? Okay.
Yep. Just a remark about calendars. It's curious that we have two different calendars for the two different seminal dates here.
You have to repeat that for me, John. I didn't quite get that.
Yeah.
You'll have to repeat that, John. I didn't quite get it.
Sir?
I didn't quite get your question.
Oh, it's not a question, it's a comment.
Okay.
It's just that we have two different calendars for the seminal dates here. Christmas is a calendar based on essentially the number of days in a year.
It has to do with the Gregorian calendar.
Whereas the crucifixion is based on the Jewish calendar.
Yes. But December the 25th it's not based on a Jewish calendar. Again, it was a date that was chosen. And finally there was consensus about it because again, a lot of different dates were put forward 200 to 400 AD before kind of everybody, at least in Western Christianity, gelled on that one. Okay. Ephraim?
This discussion about the word in Luke chapter 2, verse 7, that's the very first time I've ever heard that explanation.
Okay.
But the question that I have is when the wise men came to see Jesus, and I like you, I have concluded that it was some amount of time after Jesus' birth. Was this the exact same house in Bethlehem that Jesus was born in when he was in that house? Was that the exact same house that he was in when the wise men arrived that he was born in? I don't know if that question makes sense, but maybe you said this during the discussion. I'm trying to absorb all this, but
okay.
I'm just trying to determine.
The answer to that, Ephraim, is this. I don't know. Okay? He's born in a house. Some time has elapsed. Might be a day, might be 2 days, might be a couple of months. All right? Don't know. When we read in Matthew that they arrive at the house, looking at verse 9, after listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. It doesn't say it came over the place where the child was born. So it came over where the child was. Now, is it implied there that it's the same house? Maybe. Maybe not. So I don't know. And I don't know whether I could even answer that question beyond that he's born in a house in a guest room, or there's no room in the guest room, so he's born in the house. When the wise men come, it's also in a house. My assumption would be that it's probably the same house because the same people that let him in would have been relatives. And so I would think that they would have kept him, but, I don't know that because there's a myriad of reasons why they might have said, hey, your cousin over here has got a better setup for you. You want to go over there and stay. Part of the problem is, why do we have a dichotomy between perception and reality? Because sometimes people read into the text things that aren't actually there. So you have 3 gifts of the wise men. So how many wise men were there? 3. Except the text doesn't say that. And by the way, they had to have names, right? Well, of course they did. So we're going to give them names. And oh, by the way, what color were they? Well, usually one is depicted as black. The other 2 are white. They're usually depicted with varying kinds of ancient dress. And sometimes what's given is, and this is the legitimization for that, is that just like humanity was divided from Noah's sons, now descendants of Noah's sons all come before the king. Sounds great, doesn't it? Give me a book, chapter, and verse on that one, please. There isn't one. I don't know what color they were. I don't know what their names were. I don't even know if they were 3. They brought 3 gifts. Everything else is just embellishment that's been added later. Okay? Thank you. Any other questions out there? Bob, up here.
All I want to say is I appreciate your efforts and the research that you did, and it's been very interesting to me. Thank you.
Bob, I appreciate that. Research was research done on from a lot of different sources that are a whole lot smarter than me and put a whole lot of stuff together, and I was able to research and cull from that and put some things together. So, thank you. Aaron, up here. Aaron, and we've got then Gwen over that way. He's coming around to you, Aaron. I could have actually heard you up here without the mic.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Gabriel appears to Mary in the 6th month, which is, assuming it's a secular calendar, the 6th month, the calendar started in the fall, so that would be the spring. My understanding of the general time frame that's arrived at is because they assume that Mary conceives right after Gabriel came there, which it doesn't say. So they add 9 months from the spring and get late time of the year. And that's why there's also a difference between the Eastern and Western calendars. That's my understanding of where that started from. But also building on that, the idea that we have the 25th in our country, that's really, I think we've forgotten. We have the 12 days of Christmas is from the Western calendar acceptance of the birth to the Eastern. So we have Yuletide, we have Noel. Those are all referring to that period where they celebrated both because nobody knew. And we've just kind of forgotten that, they don't know exactly when it is. But my understanding is that's where they assumed that time of year came from. Is that your... There's a lot
of assumptions. Yes, we do have a lot of other things that go on that are not as familiar to us as modern Americans. So Yuletide, the 12 days of Christmas, we all know that from the songs, right? On the first day of Christmas, yeah. And those all date to older practices that are not as much in vogue. Yes, some of the justification is given based on the assumption of when Zechariah is serving in the temple. The problem with that is we don't have enough data on that. And then you get in the 6th month, assuming that Mary conceives immediately, which we don't know that. That's an assumption. And assumption is that Jesus is born on exactly, I don't know, what's normal gestation? How many days is normal gestation for a human? We say 9 months. It's 40, how many weeks? Come on, Nurse Jasmine, help me out here. How many weeks? 40 weeks. Yeah, right. But you can be born a month in advance. You can be born a couple of weeks later. 40 weeks is a round number, right? It's the average. If you've been pregnant, you know there's nothing average about averages, right? So there's an assumption. A lot of assumptions to get us to December the 25th, that time of the year. That's why when we have early records, we have a whole lot of people that are saying different dates. Because there wasn't really this consensus. It kind of gelled into a consensus eventually, but it was based more on the liturgical calendar than anything else, how we're going to fit that into everything else. But you are right, there's a lot of things that go on. Who's Santa Claus? Old Saint Nick, right? Comes from this 3rd century saint in Asia Minor, quote unquote saint in Asia Minor. Well, guess what? On the liturgical calendar, he has a day as well. It is, Ivana, December the 6th. December the 6th is St. Nicholas's Day. And so if you happen to be in Europe on December the 6th, you'll see some strange sights. In the Czech Republic, you'll see this guy dressed up like a bishop, not Santa Claus, in a red suit usually, but not always. He will be accompanied by an angel and a devil. Oh yes, Krampus, okay, in German lands. And they go and visit people's homes. You pay to have them come visit your homes. And the devil really terrorizes the children. Our children are all permanently scarred from our time in the Czech Republic when the devil would come and threaten to throw them in his bag and carry him off to hell. Wow, that's a peaceful holiday, isn't it? It's a great holiday if you're a parent. You love this. Kids hate it, parents love it. It's because it's St. Nicholas's Day. And there's some history behind all of that. I don't know what it is, but that's where he fits on the calendar, the liturgical calendar. Yeah. Calendars are important in other, liturgical calendars are important. In the Czech Republic, every saint has his own day. Some of you will notice that on April the 4th, I will usually post something to Ivana on Facebook. Happy Name Day. April the 4th, right? Happy Name Day. And all of a sudden, every people will comment on that and say, Happy birthday. It's not her birthday. Her birthday's in February. But April the 4th is her name day on the Czech calendar. And that's as important as birthdays in Czech culture. So I have to remember those dates every year. It's on my calendar, so I don't forget it. It's a vestige of that liturgical calendar that goes year and year and year. And it's important for a lot of people. Gwen. Was it Gwen? Gwen.
Just, it's kind of a side thing, but the census, did they just have to show up and sign a form, or did they have to get in line to sign a form, or did they have to have family members?
They had to be registered. I don't know how exactly that would have worked. So there would have been some way of keeping track, but how exactly they did that, I don't know. But it was for taxation purposes. So it was important for making sure that the Roman government was getting the kind of taxes they were supposed to get. That's the kind of thing that it was. Our census is for different purposes. We don't have a census for taxation. Our census is so that the House of Representatives can be equally or can be proportioned according to the population of the states. So, and the Electoral College, I guess, too. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I just want to say I've really enjoyed it and I've learned some new things, but The thing I always come back to is the most important thing about Christ's birth is that he fulfilled Scripture.
Absolutely. And we see that in this, born of a virgin, born in Bethlehem. It's all fulfillment of these prophecies. And by the way, when Herod wants to know where he was supposed to be born, he goes to the teachers of law. What does the prophecy say? Bethlehem. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Then I'm going to thank all of y'all for coming this evening. I will point out we have a lecture in April. It's on the death of Jesus. Okay? So similar to this, but we're going to talk about his death. There are cards in the foyer. Please feel free to take one. Put that on the calendar if you have time. I will try to be shorter in April than I was in December. Thank you.